What kind of man files papers over a single joke? I thought I was being playful when I compared my husband to my ex. But now, he's meeting with a lawyer tonight, and I can feel the walls of our marriage closing in. My name is Selene Draven. I'm 32, and I work as a receptionist at a dental clinic. People say I have a sharp tongue, but I call it wit. I've always believed a good joke can lighten the mood, even if it cuts a little deep. My husband Adrian never quite saw it that way. He's serious, careful, the kind of man who double-checks receipts and locks the doors twice. Solid, dependable, but sometimes so stiff it's hard not to tease him. That night, lying in bed, I made what I thought was a harmless joke. I laughed and said maybe he should take lessons from my ex, Luca, since Luca had always been more adventurous. To me, it was just a line, a jab to shake him out of his seriousness. But Adrian went quiet, his face tight, his body stiff. He didn't shout, didn't argue. He just rolled onto his side and said nothing. I thought he'd get over it like he always did. Instead, he moved into the guest room the next night. He barely looked at me, barely spoke. I kept telling myself he was sulking. But now he's meeting with a lawyer tonight. And suddenly, my little joke doesn't feel funny anymore. It started in the bedroom, the very place that was supposed to be private, safe, ours. Adrian had been quiet all evening, focused on his laptop while I scrolled through my phone. I felt restless, bored, and a little annoyed at his usual seriousness. He always seemed so controlled, so cautious, as if he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. To me, that kind of energy begged to be shaken, so I reached for humor. The sharp kind that always made people laugh in my circle, even if it stung. When he turned off the light and lay down, I chuckled and said, maybe you should take lessons from Luca. At least he was adventurous. I expected him to roll his eyes, maybe grumble, maybe even rise to the challenge. Instead, he froze. The room went cold in an instant, as though my words had sucked the air away. He didn't answer. He didn't ask what I meant. He didn't even move. He just rolled onto his side, his back to me, his shoulders stiff. I told myself he was sulking, being dramatic. I nudged him, laughing, saying he had no sense of humor. Still nothing. The silence stretched into the dark, heavier than any fight we'd ever had. The next morning, I found him already up, dressed, and drinking coffee at the kitchen table. He didn't look at me when I came in. Usually, he'd at least greet me, but this time, his eyes stayed on his mug. I made a joke about him acting like I'd actually cheated. I said, "Relax, it was just words, not a crime." He finally spoke, his voice low and steady. He said, "Some things aren't jokes." Then he stood, rinsed his mug, and left for work without another word. That silence followed him home that evening. He walked in, set down his bag, and went straight upstairs. I tried to follow, tried to talk, but he ignored me. Later, when I went to bed, I found his pillow gone. The guest room light was on. He had moved himself out without even discussing it. I laughed bitterly to myself, saying he was sulking like a child. I told him through the door that he was overreacting, that real men didn't hide in spare rooms. He didn't answer. The door stayed shut. By the third day, his silence had become unbearable. I tried to corner him in the kitchen, standing in front of the fridge so he couldn't walk past. I asked him if he was seriously going to drag this out. He looked me in the eye for the first time since that night. His gaze was sharp, cutting. He asked why I thought it was acceptable to compare him to another man. I rolled my eyes and said it was just a joke, that he needed to stop taking himself so seriously. His jaw tightened, but his voice was calm when he said, "Respect isn't a joke." Then he walked past me, his hand brushing mine just enough to move me aside. I tried to twist it back on him. I told him he was too sensitive, that if I couldn't laugh with him, then what was the point? He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He simply gathered his papers from the desk, slid them into a folder, and went upstairs. That night, I called my mother, Eleanor, hoping for support. I told her Adrian was sulking because I teased him about my ex. She sighed and told me I really should be careful, that some jokes went too far. I snapped, saying she was supposed to take my side. She said quietly, "You can't keep pushing him like this, Celine." Her hesitation stung more than I wanted to admit. The next day, Richard, Adrian's father, came by unexpectedly. He shook Adrian's hand firmly at the door, and they spoke in low tones I couldn't hear. When I tried to join in, Richard turned to me with a glare. He said Adrian deserved better than to be mocked in his own home. My face burned. I laughed it off, saying Richard had no idea what he was talking about, that Adrian was overreacting. Richard didn't respond. He just clapped his son on the shoulder and left, leaving me fuming in the doorway. That evening, Adrian didn't come to bed at all. I stayed up late, waiting, listening to the quiet hum of the guest room fan. Around midnight, I knocked on the door, asking if we were really going to sleep separately forever. He opened the door just a crack, his face shadowed in the dim light. He said, "I won't share a bed with someone who disrespects me." His voice was calm but final. Then he closed the door again. I lay awake the rest of the night, staring at the ceiling. I told myself he'd calm down eventually, that he always did. But something about his eyes, his voice, his silence, it all felt different this time. It felt permanent. By the weekend, the distance between us was undeniable. He spent his time in the guest room, the study, or out of the house entirely. He stopped engaging with me altogether. When I tried to joke, he ignored me. When I tried to provoke him, he stayed silent. When I tried to apologize half-heartedly, saying I didn't mean it like that, he just looked at me with those steady eyes that made my excuses shrivel on my tongue. One night, I found him at the dining table, papers spread out neatly in front of him. I asked what he was doing. He said, without looking up, "Making plans." My chest tightened. I demanded to know what kind of plans. He said, "Ones that don't include being mocked." Then he stacked the papers into a folder and walked away. The silence in the house grew thicker each day. I tried to tell myself I was still in control, that I could twist the story if I needed to. But the way Adrian moved, calm and steady, made me realize he wasn't just hurt, he was planning. And when I overheard him on the phone that evening, speaking in that same calm voice to someone about papers and appointments, I knew my joke had done more than sting. It had set everything in motion. And for the first time, I felt the cold weight of fear that I might not be able to stop him. After that first week of silence, I was desperate for someone to listen, someone who would remind me that Adrian was being ridiculous. That's why I called my cousin Marina. She was younger than me, only 28, and always eager for gossip. I thought if I told her my side of the story, she'd laugh with me and spread the version that made me look better. We met at a coffee shop downtown. I showed up in a nice coat, made sure my hair and makeup were flawless, because I wanted to look like the wronged wife, not the guilty one. Marina slid into the booth opposite me, her phone in her hand, eyes already curious. I sighed dramatically, telling her Adrian had lost his mind over a single joke. I said I teased him about my ex, Luca, one night, and he blew it out of proportion. She raised her brows, sipping her latte, and asked exactly what I'd said. I smirked and told her I had joked that maybe Adrian should take lessons from Luca, because Luca was more adventurous. I expected her to laugh, to agree it was silly. Instead, she gave me a look that made me shift uncomfortably. She said, "You actually said that?" To his face, I waved it off, saying Adrian knew I was joking, that he just had no sense of humor. I told her men needed to be able to handle banter, or else marriage would be boring. Marina nodded slowly but didn't laugh. Instead, she asked if I thought Adrian might not see it as banter, but as humiliation. I rolled my eyes and said she was too young to understand, that men like Adrian needed to lighten up, but I noticed the way she glanced at her phone every few minutes. I knew her well enough to recognize that she was already planning how to tell this story to her friends. Part of me liked that. At least, my version of the story would get out first. I leaned in and said, "Make sure you tell it right. He's sulking like a child, not talking to me, sleeping in the guest room like he's the victim." She smirked, promised she'd handle it, and we parted ways. When I got home, I felt better, convinced the gossip would spin in my favor. But Damien was waiting in the living room, his posture calm, his expression unreadable. He asked if I had enjoyed my coffee with Marina. My stomach clenched. I asked how he knew. He said he didn't have to ask. He knew me. His calmness unnerved me, like he already knew what had been said. I tried to provoke him, saying he was paranoid, that I couldn't even have coffee with family without being accused. He simply replied, "You can have coffee with anyone you want. Just remember, words spread faster than you think." Then he stood and went upstairs, leaving me fuming on the couch. The next day, I found out what he meant. My card was declined at the grocery store. Embarrassed, I tried another, declined again. The cashier's stare made my cheeks burn. I stormed out, groceries abandoned, and drove straight home. I burst through the door, shouting his name. He was at the dining table again, papers stacked neatly in front of him. I waved my useless cards in the air and demanded an explanation. He said calmly, "The accounts are frozen." Just like that. No hesitation, no apology. I gasped, saying he had no right, that it was our money. He replied, "It was my responsibility to protect what I earned." I tried to twist it, calling it financial abuse, accusing him of trying to control me. His gaze didn't waver. He said, "I won't let disrespect take everything I've built." His calm tone infuriated me more than yelling ever could. That evening, Eleanor called. She had heard already. Of course she had, thanks to Marina's loose tongue. She asked if it was true that I had compared Adrian to Luca. I admitted it, but laughed, saying it was nothing serious. She sighed and told me I had gone too far. I snapped, saying she was supposed to be on my side. She said, "I am, but I can't defend the indefensible." Her words stung, leaving me shaking with anger. Later that night, Adrian carried a small bag into the guest room. I demanded to know why he was packing. He said, "I like to be prepared." That simple answer made my stomach twist with dread. I followed him down the hall, shouting that he was trying to abandon me, that no real man would walk away over words. He stopped, turned, and said, "No real man would stay after being disrespected like that." Then he closed the door. I lay awake for hours, scrolling through my phone, trying to find something to distract me from the silence in the house. Every creak, every sound from the guest room made my chest tighten. I thought about Marina's smirk, my mother's sigh, Richard's glare. For the first time, I wondered if the story was slipping out of my control. By morning, my fears deepened. A text from a friend popped up, asking if it was true that I'd told Adrian to learn from my ex. My hands trembled as I typed back, insisting it was a joke, but I knew the damage was spreading faster than I could contain it. And when I came downstairs, I found Adrian already dressed, folder in hand, heading for the door. I asked where he was going. He said, "To fix things properly." My heart sank. I demanded to know what that meant, but he only looked at me once, his eyes steady, and said, "You'll find out." Then he left, closing the door behind him with finality. The silence that followed was unbearable. The accounts were frozen, the gossip was out, and Adrian was making plans I couldn't see. And for the first time, I realized he wasn't just sulking. He was moving on a path I couldn't control. The family dinner was supposed to be my chance to reset the story. I had convinced myself that if I played it right, I could paint Adrian as overly sensitive, and my family would pressure him to calm down. I dressed in a soft blue dress, did my hair in careful waves, and told myself I'd charm everyone like I always did. By the time we arrived at my mother's house, I was already rehearsing my lines in my head. Eleanor greeted us warmly, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. Richard was already seated at the head of the table, his posture stiff, his gaze fixed on Adrian. My cousin Marina sat at the side, phone in her hand, smirk tugging at her lips. She looked at me like I was a character in one of her stories, not a relative in crisis. The air was heavy, like everyone knew the script except me. We started eating, the clink of silverware filling the silence. I launched quickly into conversation, telling stories about work, laughing too loudly, insisting Adrian and I were fine. I said we'd been busy, distracted, but still strong as ever. I wanted to paint the picture of a solid marriage. as if all the gossip was just exaggeration. But then Richard cut in, his voice sharp. He asked Adrian directly if it was true, that I had compared him to my ex, Luca. My stomach dropped. I tried to laugh it off, waving a hand, saying it was nothing but a silly remark. I told everyone I was only teasing, that jokes kept a marriage alive. Adrian didn't let me hide. He reached into his folder and pulled out a printed page. He laid it on the table in front of everyone. My words, the ones I had thought were harmless, were there in black and white. A copy of the very message I had sent Marina when I bragged about the joke, saying Adrian needed lessons from Luca. My breath caught. Marina smirked, not even embarrassed. The table went silent. My mother gasped softly, pressing her hand to her mouth. Richard's face hardened. Marina leaned closer, pretending to skim the words like she hadn't already memorized them. Heat rushed up my neck. I scrambled for control. I insisted it was just banter, that Adrian knew me, that I didn't mean it seriously. I accused him of dragging private matters into the open, humiliating me on purpose. My voice rose, my hands shaking as I gestured wildly. Adrian's reply was calm, steady. He said, "I don't have to humiliate you. Your own words do that." His voice was low, but it cut deeper than any shouting ever could. My mother tried to defend me, saying I was her daughter, that I hadn't meant harm. But even she faltered, her voice trembling, her eyes downcast as she admitted it had been careless. Richard leaned forward, his voice sharp, telling Adrian he was right to take action, that no man should tolerate such disrespect. I felt like the walls were closing in, every set of eyes turning against me. I lashed out, accusing Adrian of being controlling, of exaggerating to look noble. I said he was trying to punish me for being more fun than him. Eleanor whispered my name, pleading for me to stop, but her words were drowned out by Richard's stern tone. He told Adrian he had his full support, that he needed to protect his dignity. And then Adrian dropped the final blow. He said calmly that he had already met with a lawyer. My heart stopped. He said the consultation had gone well, and he would be moving forward. He didn't raise his voice, didn't look triumphant. He just stated it as fact, like it was already decided. The table erupted in murmurs. My mother began to cry softly, dabbing her eyes with a napkin. Richard nodded firmly, his pride in Adrian obvious. Marina's smirk grew wider, her phone buzzing quietly in her hand. I knew she was already spreading this to her friends, maybe even posting cryptic little notes online about truth bombs at dinner. I tried to fight back, my voice breaking, as I accused Adrian of destroying us, of rushing to outsiders instead of working it out at home. He looked at me, calm and unflinching, and said, "There's nothing left to destroy." His words hit me harder than anything else he'd said. The rest of dinner was unbearable. No one touched their dessert. My mother kept sniffling. Richard stayed silent, and Adrian quietly gathered his papers, slipping them back into his folder. He didn't look at me again. He didn't need to. On the drive home, I tried to speak, to beg, to twist it back into a misunderstanding. But Adrian kept his eyes on the road, his hand steady on the wheel. The silence between us was heavier than stone. When we pulled into the driveway, he got out without a word, went straight inside, and closed the guest room door behind him. I stood there in the dark car, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my heart racing. It hit me then that the story was no longer mine to control. The joke I thought would make me look witty had turned into evidence, proof of disrespect that Adrian could carry into any room, any conversation. He had the papers, the support, even my own family shifting to his side. And worst of all, he had the lawyer. The decision was already in motion, and I was powerless to stop it. The night after that disastrous dinner, the house felt like a cage. Adrian shut himself in the guest room, and I was left pacing the halls like a trapped animal. Every time I passed the closed door, anger boiled in me. I wanted him to open it, to yell, to argue, to give me something I could fight against. But his silence was worse than any shouting. It made me invisible. I tried the soft approach first. I knocked gently, asking if we could talk. No answer. I pressed my forehead to the door, whispering that I was sorry, that I didn't mean the joke like it sounded, that I still loved him. The silence stretched. Finally, his voice came through, calm and distant. Sorry doesn't erase disrespect. Then nothing. The words stung because they weren't shouted. They were steady, final, like a stone dropped into deep water. I switched to anger. I banged on the door, demanding he stop hiding like a coward. I shouted that he was weak for running to lawyers instead of facing me. My voice cracked as I accused him of planning to ruin me, just to look noble in front of his father. He didn't respond. The light under the door stayed steady, unshaken. The next morning, I tried another tactic, guilt. I followed him into the kitchen, saying he was abandoning me, that he had promised vows, that marriage meant working through things. I even cried, clutching at his arm. He set down his coffee mug carefully, looked me in the eyes and said, "Marriage also means respect. You broke it." He gently pulled his arm away and left for work without another word. I spent that whole day in a spiral. I called my mother again, begging her to convince Adrian to stop this madness. She hesitated, her voice heavy. She said I needed to take responsibility. I shouted back that she was betraying me, siding with him. She said softly, "I'm siding with what's right." Her words hollowed me out. That afternoon, a courier knocked on the door. He handed me a thick envelope, my name printed neatly across the front. My hands trembled as I tore it open. Inside were legal documents, separation papers. The language was cold, clinical, cutting. Financial divisions, living arrangements, even notes about the house. My name, his name, side by side. Adrian had already signed. My throat tightened, my hands shaking as I read. When Adrian came home that evening, I was waiting in the living room, papers clutched in my fist. I demanded to know if this was his idea of a joke. He looked at me calmly, his face unreadable, and said, "No jokes. Just decisions." I screamed that he was destroying us, tearing apart years of marriage over a single comment. He replied, "It wasn't one comment. It was everything that comment revealed." His words cut deeper than any argument. I tried to tear the papers in front of him, but he didn't even flinch. He said, "Tear them. I'll file more." His calm tone made me want to throw something, to break the walls just to get a reaction. But he turned away, went upstairs and closed the door. That night, I sat at the dining table, the papers spread out in front of me. I stared at the words until they blurred. For years I had believed I could twist any story, turn any mistake into something forgivable. But now the evidence was in writing, stamped, official. My excuses had no place on those pages. The silence in the house pressed in on me. I picked up my phone, scrolling through messages, but most people hadn't replied in days. Marina had posted another cryptic line online. Some jokes cost more than people realize. My cheeks burned. The gossip was everywhere, and I couldn't control it. I thought of calling Richard, begging him to talk to his son, but I knew what he would say. He had already made his stance clear. To him, Adrian was right to take the step. I was the one who had failed. By midnight, I was pacing again. I went upstairs, stood outside the guest room door, and whispered desperately that we could fix this, that I would change, that I would never make jokes like that again. I promised him anything, everything. There was silence for a long time. Then his voice came through, low and steady. "Change after destruction isn't change. It's regret." My knees went weak. I pressed my ear to the door, but heard nothing else. No footsteps, no movement, just silence. Back downstairs, I stared at the papers again. My chest felt heavy, my breath uneven. The signatures stared back at me like a sentence already passed. And when the clock struck midnight, the truth settled over me like ice. Adrian wasn't threatening anymore. He was acting. The courier, the papers, his calm certainty, everything was already in motion. I had thought my joke would pass like every other sharp remark, but it hadn't. It had become the wedge that split everything apart. And now the marriage I mocked was dissolving in real time, with the kind of quiet certainty I couldn't fight. The mediation office was nothing like I had pictured. No shouting, no gavel, no jury. Just a plain conference room with beige walls, a polished table, and the smell of old coffee. It felt clinical, like a doctor's office for broken marriages. I sat at one end with my lawyer beside me, clutching my purse like it was a shield. Adrian sat at the other end, calm as ever, his lawyer neat and prepared, a thick folder open in front of him. He didn't even glance at me. That calmness, that refusal to acknowledge me, made me feel smaller than any insult could have. The mediator began with polite words about cooperation, respect, and resolving disputes fairly. I wanted to laugh at the irony. What was fair about being ambushed like this? I tried to speak out of turn, insisting this wasn't necessary, that we were just having a marital spat. The mediator raised a hand gently and said we needed to follow procedure. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms, glaring at Adrian, who remained unreadable. My lawyer spoke first. She described me as a loving wife who had made a single ill-timed joke, nothing more. She said there had been no affair, no betrayal, just careless words. She argued that divorce was too drastic, that we could salvage the marriage if Adrian would stop taking things so literally. I nodded along, forcing tears into my eyes to look sincere. Then Adrian's lawyer began. He slid documents across the table, financial records, printed screenshots, even notes Adrian had kept. My throat tightened as I skimmed them. My own words, about Luca, about Adrian needing lessons, stared up at me in bold ink. Taken out of context, they looked cruel. Even I could see it. The lawyer spoke calmly, methodically, about patterns of disrespect, about the emotional damage such words caused. He didn't embellish, he didn't need to. The evidence was plain. I interrupted, saying they were just jokes, that everyone teased in relationships. I accused Adrian of being humorless, of dragging private matters into public spaces. The mediator asked me to let the lawyer finish. I clenched my fists under the table, my nails digging into my palms. When it was Adrian's turn to speak, he didn't launch into accusations. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "Respect is the foundation of marriage. Without it, there is nothing." His words hung in the air, steady, devastating. He explained that he had tried to overlook smaller slights, tried to laugh with me when he could, but the comparison to Luca, the deliberate humiliation, was a line that could not be crossed. He said calmly, "I will not build a life with someone who ridicules me." I wanted to scream. Instead, I leaned forward, my voice sharp, insisting he was throwing away years of love over a joke. I said he was dramatic, cruel, weak for involving lawyers. He looked at me for a long moment, then said, "Weakness is pretending everything is fine while you're being torn down piece by piece." I froze. The mediator began outlining the separation terms. My access to the joint accounts would remain restricted. Adrian would retain control of his savings and investments. I would receive a modest allowance until the final settlement, but only with oversight. The house was to be sold, proceeds divided, unless Adrian chose to buy me out. The words blurred together in my head, each sentence hammering another nail into the coffin of the life I thought I still controlled. My lawyer tried to argue, saying Adrian was overreacting, that financial punishment was unnecessary. The mediator listened but didn't shift. Adrian's lawyer countered every point with precision. They had prepared too well. At one point, I turned to Adrian directly, my voice trembling, asking if this was really what he wanted. He met my gaze for the first time that day. His eyes were calm, steady, unyielding. He said, "This is what respect for myself looks like." Then he signed the papers in front of me, each stroke of his pen slow and deliberate. My heart pounded. I hesitated when the documents were pushed toward me. My hands shook as I picked up the pen. I wanted to throw it, to rip the pages, to storm out. But the mediator's expectant gaze, the weight of the silence, and Adrian's steady calm held me there. I signed, my name scrawled in uneven lines. The room exhaled as if the decision had been sealed. Adrian stood, gathered his folder neatly, and nodded once to the mediator. He didn't look at me. He walked out with his lawyer, his steps measured, his back straight. Richard was waiting in the lobby. I saw him clap Adrian on the shoulder, pride in his eyes. Eleanor wasn't there. I realized she couldn't face it. I sat frozen in my chair, the signed papers in front of me, the ink still drying. My lawyer murmured something about next steps, but I barely heard her. All I could think about was the way Adrian's voice had sounded. Steady, final, absolute. I had thought I could twist the story, paint myself as misunderstood, cast him as overly sensitive. But sitting in that sterile room, the evidence laid out, my words in black and white, there was no spin left. The joke I thought was harmless had become my confession, and Adrian had turned it into his freedom. By the time I walked out of the building, the sky had turned grey, clouds heavy with rain. The city moved around me, people laughing, talking, rushing home. I stood still, clutching the strap of my purse, the papers inside like a weight dragging me down. Adrian had walked away with dignity, and I was left with the taste of ashes in my mouth, realizing that a single sentence had cost me everything. The house didn't feel like mine anymore. Every sound echoed too loudly. Every room seemed stripped of warmth. Adrian moved through it with quiet efficiency, carrying boxes, folding clothes, sorting papers. He didn't rush, but he didn't pause either. It was like he had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in his head and was now performing it with perfect calm. I hovered near the doorway, arms crossed, trying to mask my panic with anger. I demanded to know if he was really going through with it, if he was truly going to end a marriage over one joke. He didn't even stop taping a box. He just said, "It was never just one." His voice was steady, measured, the kind of tone that couldn't be argued with. I tried again, softer this time. I begged him to stay, told him I could change, told him we could rebuild. I reminded him of our wedding vows, the promises we made. He set down the tape, looked me in the eye and said, "Promises mean nothing without respect." My throat closed. I wanted to scream, to tear up the boxes, to make him fight me. But he turned back to his work, calm as stone. By afternoon, the neighbors began to notice. Curtains twitched, blinds shifted. Mrs. Holland from across the street lingered on her porch, pretending to water her plants, but staring openly. Heat rushed to my face. I hissed at Adrian that he was humiliating me in front of everyone. Without looking up, he replied, "You did that yourself." The words burned more than if he had shouted. My mother arrived unexpectedly, her face pale, her hands twisting in her lap as she sat on the couch. She whispered that maybe I should let him go, that dragging it out would only make it worse. I snapped, accusing her of betrayal. She cried, saying she loved me but couldn't defend what I'd done. Her tears only made me angrier, because I wanted her to take my side, not fold into his logic. Richard showed up not long after. He didn't even look at me. He clapped Adrian on the back, proud, and said this was the right decision. The two of them spoke quietly near the door, their voices low and calm. I stood in the hallway, fists clenched, feeling like an outsider in my own life. When Richard left, he nodded once at me, his eyes cold, and shut the door firmly behind him. I tried one last tactic, rage. I shouted that Adrian was weak, that no real man would run to lawyers, that he was abandoning me to look noble. My words bounced off him like stones against steel. He slid the last box into the trunk of his car, closed it with a soft click, and turned to me. His face was calm, but his eyes were tired, resolute. He said, "This isn't running. This is refusing to live in contempt." Then he walked past me, his step steady. I ran after him, grabbing his arm before he opened the driver's door. My voice cracked as I begged him not to go, promised him I'd change, swore it had all been a mistake. For a moment, he looked at me, really looked. Then he said, "Change after the damage is regret. I need peace, not promises." He gently removed my hand, opened the door, and slid into the driver's seat. The engine started, low and steady. I stood there, tears streaking down my face, pounding the window, shouting that he was abandoning me, that he was throwing everything away. He didn't respond. He backed out of the driveway slowly, carefully, like a man who had already rehearsed leaving. Richard's car was parked nearby, waiting, and Adrian gave him a nod before driving down the street. The neighbors slipped back into their homes, leaving the street eerily quiet. I stood barefoot on the porch, my heart racing, watching the car shrink into the distance. The taillights disappeared around the corner, and the silence that followed pressed down on me like a weight I couldn't lift. Inside, the house was hollow. His side of the closet was empty, drawers left open and bare. The guest room, once a symbol of distance, was stripped clean. Even the air smelled different, less like him, more like dust. I walked through the rooms in a daze, touching the empty spaces where his things had been, my chest aching. I sank onto the couch, staring at the wall, the silence deafening. For years, I had believed I could twist any story, spin any mistake into something forgivable. I had told myself that jokes were harmless, that sharp words kept life exciting, but Adrian hadn't fought me. He hadn't yelled or begged. He had simply walked away with dignity. And that dignity was stronger than any excuse I had left. The evening shadows stretched across the empty living room, turning corners dark. I sat motionless, clutching the papers he had already signed, my signature beside his, the ink still stark against the white. Every word on the page was a reminder that this was real, final, unshakable. When night fell, the house seemed colder, heavier, as if it knew it no longer belonged to us. I wrapped my arms around myself, listening to the silence. No footsteps in the hall, no steady voice from another room, no presence beside me. Adrian was gone, and I was left alone, staring at the ruins of a marriage I had mocked to death with my own careless words. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Write in the comments from which city you are watching.